The detour is recent. The detour is like in the past 6 months, because that also messed me up.
Oh, I thought, don't you work here?
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
I work here, but I rarely come to campus.
Oh.
Yeah, I work mostly remotely. I think we're good enough to start. When folks start trickling in, they'll catch up. I'll take this off so you can hear me a little bit better. Hi, everybody. I'm Eli. I'm the GIS analyst here at Siege. Today, we're going to be talking about the MDEJ screen. This is the third version of the tool. So we're going to, the lecture is divided into two parts. The first is just general uses and development, and the second one is more technical, more about how the model was built. So I'm just going to dive right into it. All right, just a quick shout out to my colleagues over at the GIS team at Siege, Dr. Haile Tedessi and Bukola Agabula, both great people, phenomenal coworkers. Bukola, unfortunately, is ill, and so she's not present today, but she's with us in spirit. So what are we doing here? So MDEJ screen, or any EJ screen, focuses on creating an index in order for people to be able to assess the relative environmental justice quotient in their neighborhood. Why is that important? Well, because as you can see here, zip codes are more or less, not even more, or not even less, just more effective at predicting your general health outcome and your socioeconomic outcome than literally anything else. Your zip code affects things, your access to healthcare, your access to education, the amount of toxins in your environment, the relative AQI, heat, every single thing can be narrowed down to where you live and your proximity to other services. And because of that, it requires a more holistic approach to how we gauge the health outcomes of environmental pathogens. So if you can see on the little diagram on the side, health only contributes to about 20% of what you are, like your healthfulness as a person. Everything else is, psychological, environmental, social, the kind of less tangible things that make very concrete differences on how you feel and your healthfulness on a day-to-day basis. So what is the MDEJ screen? The MDEJ screen is a tool that was developed by Siege. It is a Maryland-centric version of another EJ screening tool from California, the Cal EJ screen. We have tweaked it to be more suitable for the state of Maryland, and I'll go into a little bit more into that later. But the general goal of this tool is to give users the ability to kind of very quickly and accurately assess their relative environmental quotient compared to their peers in the rest of the state. So why don't we just use one of the other EJ tools? There's the CGIS tool, there's the EPA EJ screening tool. I think DNR, the Maryland DNR has an EJ tool. Why don't we use any of those? We kind of do, but we don't entirely. And the reason for that is context. The context of people living in the ground in Maryland is markedly different than those who are living in New Jersey, New York, Maryland, or Pennsylvania, California, or as a whole in the United States. In order to have an accurate assessment of individuals in Maryland's health quotient, we have to take data that is relevant to Maryland. So while we could and do use some of the data that the EPA does provide, we have to focus more on local and contextually relevant data sources in order to kind of accurately determine what the EJ quotient looks like in these neighborhoods. So how is it made? So the EJ score is a composite score. It's an index. Indices are kind of like a mix between art and science. They're a way to condense a large amount of information into a single score. When you do that, obviously you lose a lot of the nuance, right? We're losing a lot of the contextual information when we narrow it down. But the usefulness in this is that it's a lot easier for lay people to understand a 0 to 100 scale as a, just a relative measure than it is to be able to, narrow down into the individual aspects of that data source. While we do give people the opportunity to do that in the tool, the front-facing portion of it is just that, is just your score and the things that make up your score. So the way the score is made is we have 5 different bins of variables or domains that we then run through our EJ formula, which I'll go into in a second, which provides an index score. Now, the variables are very wide, so I'm not even going to bother listing them all in here. They're all available to check on the website. But what they all contain different types of data relevant to the various bins. So we have health data, which obviously is about access to healthcare, along with the reported rates of things like COPD, asthma, diabetes, and smoking propensity, among others. Climate change obviously looks into things like heating and water rise. Environmental effects are things like toxic exposure, the health impacts of toxic exposure. So we're looking at NATA cancer rates, things like that. And then environmental exposure is the literal exposure. How close are you to toxic facilities, wastewater treatment plants, and things of that nature? And then the largest bin is socioeconomic, right? So this is everything from the amount of the race composite of a neighborhood to their income to education level. There's so many in that one. But what we do is we take each one of those numbers and we run it through this formula, which is the demographic index minus the national average of the demographic index. The demographic index is a pretty straightforward and simplistic way of understanding the relative disadvantage that a community experiences. And it does this simply by taking the average of the population who's under the poverty line in that area and the population of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, dividing it by 2. Pretty simple. And that gives us an index score. What's important to note about the index score is that the number itself is meaningless. It actually doesn't, the range can go from -1,000 to +1,000,000. The number itself doesn't give us a lot of information. What it does do is allow us to put it on a relative scale for the rest of the tracks in the state. So that's where the advantage comes in. Now, it is important to note that all of these measures are relative to people in the state of Maryland. So if you expand this assessment out past the state of Maryland, it's not accurate. So how do we weigh the model? As I mentioned, the model has 5 bins, and essentially we've just created a score that treats them all equally. This is good in the sense that it allows us to include as much data as we want from each one of these domains. The downside of it is that it's not as statistically relevant or statistically accurate because the general impact of these things is so ephemeral that it's kind of hard to determine, what the weighted criteria should be. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up, though, is because since we have this score in action now, we can start using these numbers to determine the on-the-ground weighting of what these effects or what these bins actually do. So we can kind of use our numbers that we've developed and compare them to on-the-ground metrics such as poverty, asthma rates, and so on, to see how they match up. So when we take our individual data sources, the way we create the final score is we take the average of each one of these sets of indices, each one of these bins, we multiply them together, and then we get an EJ score. And similar to the index score, the score itself is pretty meaningless. The number is meaningless. So we have to put it on a relative scale, which we do from 0 to 100. Essentially, we just reclassify the numbers so that they are in a more legible format. So with these numbers, what you end up with these numbers are percentiles. And percentile is, as it says over there, represents the number of tracks or the percentage of tracks that have a lower score or a better EJ value than the track that you select, right? So for this tracked example, we see it has a exposure level of 100, which means that while there are some tracks that have probably equivalent levels of exposure, there are no tracks that have more toxic exposure. But every other track that is not 100 is going to have less exposure than this one. We take all of those numbers, average them out, and then we get the EJ score. So how can we use this in our communities to help identify EJ pathogens? So since we're a little short on time, I can't go into full detail, but what you do is you pull up the tool, which looks like this in real life.
When you say pathogen, you're not talking about biological.
No, I'm talking about environmental and climatological pathogens.
Okay, so anything bad.
Basically, yeah. We don't really track anything good on this list, unfortunately. So what you want to do is you go onto the website. By the way, the link is up here. And you can search your neighborhood. So we'll do College Park. If I can type, sorry. Hey, look at that. It'll take us to where it is. And then you can click on it and it'll give you the baseline EJ scores, right? So we have our EJ score of 1, a demographic score of 12, environmental 7, so on and so forth. And as you can see, the only real notable one is the health EJ score. So
the averages?
I'm sorry?
Okay, so for your index,
Mhm.
you take averages, multiply them together to get the score, right? So,
Correct.
All right, so these are the individual categories.
Correct.
I'm sure I follow you.
Yep.
Right, so you haven't, then you're going to average these. Where's the averaging come in?
Right here. The final result is the average score. The number, obviously, if you take these numbers and add them up and average them, you don't get one.
Right.
We average the index score and then reclassify them to get the percentile. So we don't average the reclassified scores.
Okay, I think I'll get it as you go along. All right. Sorry.
No, you're fine. Okay, so you look at your area. Then you look into the data set to see, what is causing the most issues essentially in this score. So for this one, I think this is Chevrolet I pulled out. It has a high environmental effect score and a high climate score. So then you would go into the individual domains. So you'll see here on the left-hand side, it has the individual domains. So let's go to, now we have had some issues with the server today, so I'm not sure if it's going to work. Oh, there it goes. So when you go into the individual domains, you can look at the things that are contributing to that portion of the score. And it gives you the, again, relative amount of exposure to the pathogens compared to the rest of the tracks in Maryland, okay? It's just an important bit of context. And then the final portion is then you collect a report. Now, this isn't the actual report. Our server was down, so I couldn't get the actual image, but it does essentially look like this. All it does is it tells you whether or not the district you're looking at, the tract you're looking at, is giving you a proportionally higher score in domains compared to the average of the state. Basically allows you to say with some statistical validity that this is positively having a negative effect on our community. So what are the limitations of this? The biggest limitations come from the data. The that comes from mostly recency, reliability, and scope. Availability is an issue in certain cases, as there are sometimes the data is not easily accessible to us and we have to kind of like go out of our way to find it. But that's usually something we can work around. Scope is the biggest issue. When you're doing environmental justice, when you're creating an environmental justice index, you want to be as close to the ground as possible. You want to get as much individualized data as you can in order to make your assessments. The problem is that that's not really how data collection works on a large scale. We are limited in our ability to collect data individually, so we have to rely on government sources, right? So census, EPA, so on. And usually the finest grain detail you can get is the census tract level, sometimes the census block level. And that's the biggest limitation. If we could get more narrow data, the scores could actually generate a lot more statistical relevance. But because because of that limitation, there are certain things we have to disregard entirely that would be really important to know, like as a variable within a domain. So things like AQI comes to mind, where the data exists, but the scope of the data is almost always so large that it's not really meaningful on an individual level.
Can you define tract and block?
Yeah. So a census tract is, I'm sure you've kind of heard that term before. Whenever they're doing, whenever the, I think it's the Commerce Department does the census, they subdivide the state or the country into individual tracts, which have which are contiguous and contain relatively the same amount of people for each tract. I think it's something like 4,800 to 6,800 or something along those lines. So while the size of the tract may change, the population ratio is generally the same between each individual tract. A block is a tract divided in half, essentially. It's a slightly smaller scope, but again, the data isn't always collected on that level. It is almost always collected on a census tract level. So if you look here, you'll see that a census tract can cover a pretty large area. Oops.
Yeah. Just like a comment,
Mhm.
talking about communities here.
Mhm.
So 4,800 people. I mean, my community, I live in Frederick, so we only had 70,000 people in the city.
Mhm.
But I would consider my neighborhood, I don't know, maybe 10 blocks, 10 square blocks. So I don't think we have 4,800 people living in that area.
No, probably not.
Right. So what I'm saying is that I agree with you. Yeah, this is too broad a scope. Right. So yeah. So all right, go ahead. I wonder what I could do for studies that I'd like to do.
We will be getting to that actually. So hold that thought. Now the other main issue is statistical. Whenever you're doing a statistical assessment in a set of data, you're always introducing error into your data set, basically just trying to determine which is noise and which is not, which is actually relevant information. And that especially comes out when we're talking about interpolated values. This is kind of a heavy subject, so I'm just going to give you the quick and dirty version. Interpolation is essentially making a reasonable guess about what the value of a variable would be without actually measuring it. So what you do is we're taking, say, a single point on a map that has some data associated with it, let's say temperature, and we can say we have one point with the temperature data and we have another point with the temperature data, and we kind of use those 2 points to kind of guess what all the area around between those 2 points would be. Now it is statistically valid, but it obviously relies on having as many data points as possible in order to make as strong an assessment as possible, which isn't always the case. So what do you do once you know what your EJ scores are? Like I said, this is not a tool that you should be using to diagnose individual problems in your community. This is this is a bit more broad than that. It allows you to talk with some authority about saying about recognizing what pathogens in your community may be having the greatest impact, and allowing you to identify and address those with your either legislators or in your community. Um, when you're looking at your score, it's important to recognize that the score itself gives you a starting point. It really kind of allows you to, it gives you confirmation of what you might be experiencing in your neighborhood, but also could just kind of illuminate some problems that you might not have even known about in your neighborhood. And so by looking at the scores, by sending these reports to your representatives and looking at the individual metrics that create these composites, identifying, say, wastewater is a high problem here, or nitration, or so on, using these data points, just talk with some confidence to your representatives is really the use of this tool. And in that, we've actually worked on creating legislation that incorporates these values and these metrics into Maryland's decision-making when it comes to environmental concerns. Because this is such a wide scope, folks, because this is such a wide scope, it allows you to kind of go up to your legislators and say, hey, we can identify these 3 things on this metric that are causing direct harm to our communities. And here is a piece of information that allows you to track how this variable compares to that same variable across the state of Maryland. And using that information to make judgment calls about how policy should proceed. Just some future resources. This tool is available at our website, Siege Center. We also have a Maryland Park Equity Screening tool and the EPA's EJ Screen, both of which are very valuable tools, which can be used in much the same way. So I know I kind of sped through that, but so that's the end of part 1. So if you guys have any questions for me right now, please feel free, and then or we can go into the modeling portion. But if you guys have any questions in the future, always feel free to email me. Yeah.
I'm just wondering when the EPA EJ tool was created.
I think 2019. Actually, that's a good point. Something I forgot to mention. I'm not sure if you guys remember, but there was this thing that happened a couple of years back called COVID, and it really messed up data collection. And so one of the biggest challenges that I faced when developing this tool was getting data that was as recent as possible. And data was not being pre-processed in 2020 and 2021, and they're just starting to get to it now. So a lot of the data I used to construct this tool came from the 2022 American Community Survey. So that's a lot of the demographic and health information, but a lot of the environmental, climatological, and industrial information came from data sets that are 2019 or older. So they're really not as relevant anymore. Not to say that they don't contribute to the tool, but it's important to note that there were drastic changes that happened in our environment during COVID that this tool does not account for. There was obviously a lower AQI, people were traveling less, but there was also higher mortality. So this tool doesn't capture that space and time. And it is a bit of a fault, but also that time was such an outlier that I don't know how much bearing it's going to have on the future.
Kind of on the line of thinking about the data, I thought you had a methodology, but the top, or do you have information built into this? So if you're like, where is that data from, or like,
Yeah,
where was that from? Okay.
Yeah, all the sources are available on the website. And I have a metadata page that I need to update, but it's going to have all the stuff I'm about to talk to you about how I did the modeling for the rest of it.
Cool.
So,
Yeah.
I'm confused, so your concluding side before this one, I think, you said that, or a couple back, yeah, using it, is that the one before? Yeah, so you were saying, yeah, report to your representative. So you get us a lot of comments, about how ungranular, I guess the term would be, how broad of scope this is. So, for instance, relying on interpolated values and also the census tract, census block. So, and I mentioned my interest in trying to do something in my community, which is, far less than 4,800 people. So I don't understand how you could use this. So what would I live in Frederick, Maryland. So I could go to my congressman and say, there's data for Frederick, Maryland that, we are a heat island. But, all right, so I want something more granular. I want to say my neighborhood's a heat island because we don't have any trees. We have a lot of asphalt, in my, say, 9-block area on the east side of the city. Right, so how could I use that? Is there, with this EJ score, any way I can make a case for my neighborhood?
Yeah. So if we look at, let's go to Frederick. Oh my God. All right. So if we look at Frederick, it's actually, this section is a pretty small census tract, geographically speaking. So obviously I don't know where your neighborhood is in relation to this.
That's good if it's small.
I'm sorry?
That's good if it's small.
If you want to talk about your individual neighborhood, the smaller the resolution, the better. Right? Because you have to think of it like a camera lens, right? So if we're focusing in, you're going to have a smaller portion of the image, but it's going to be a lot clearer. So a similar idea here. But even if you're not, even if this doesn't, or even if your tract is, say, twice the size, like in this, which is still Frederick County, but is, literally twice the size of the other one, the generalized information is still relevant to you because you're part of that population in that tract. Even though it's not directly at your neighborhood level, you can still say we are experiencing, environmental effects and climate change at a higher rate than, more than 2/3 of the state.
Right, but I might have a chemical plant, 2 blocks away, emitting fumes in my neighborhood, and that may not be captured in a broader tract.
No, it won't.
Yeah.
And that is one of the flaws. I mean, there's no way around it. Like I said, this is a starting point. This is not like what you should be using to diagnose the issues in your community. You should be using it as a generalized tool to say, we can recognize that there is something that is harming our community in, our air or in our water. So
if there's something significant enough that it shows up,
yeah,
because of this broad scope.
Or you can use that in conjunction with the things you're like,
right.
you have this chemical plant and this is going on.
Yes, right.
You're using it as another data point to make your judgments and to inform your representatives. It's not like if you wanted to understand the impact of a single plant in your community, that requires a much more targeted study. There's just no way around that.
And who would I go to get that study?
Oh, that's a great question. Honestly, I don't know. I would say usually, so if we're talking about environmental pathogens, we're usually talking about water, toxicity, so either lead or nitrogen, or we're talking about air quality. So that's also going to be nitrogen, carbon monoxide, black carbon, PM2.5 and PM10, right? So like generally speaking, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about direct health effects in neighborhoods. Both of those, I know that in terms of water quality and that kind of stuff, the state does do testing that I'm pretty sure you can just call your representative or just send in a vial. I think you can get them at Home Depot, pretty sure. Where you can test the soil and water quality. But yeah, I think honestly, it comes down to making enough noise so that folks pay attention and want to investigate it. And that's where the activism portion of environmental justice really comes
Probably Dr.
through.
Wilson could put me in touch with neighborhoods that
Oh,
are
absolutely.
doing different tests.
And I know that sorry. No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say we can talk about, because there are a few people I was talking to about doing air pollution testing in our neighborhoods. So there are like smaller local programs.
And I know that one of our PhD students, Vivek, is in charge of setting up our community network of air quality monitors. So if you're looking for air quality monitors, I would talk to him because he could help. Okay, yeah. So yeah, he could help you set that up. All right. So we actually only have 5 minutes. I'm going to draw us out for an extra 10, just so I can kind of zoom through some extra stuff, if that's all right. You'll still be able to get lunch, I promise. Okay. So this is another 45 minutes, and I'm going to zoom through it in 10. Okay. So there's a lot of gaps going to be happening here. This is the interpolated portion. We're talking about proximity analysis. Now, there's two different methods of proximity analysis that I use in this model. The first is proportional impact. So when we're talking about municipal services, things like police stations, hospitals, et cetera, the way we used to track whether or not there were, how much community members were being serviced by these facilities was basically just by counting how many X, Y, and Z are near your neighborhood. And that's not really a great way to do it because, just because there's a police station in your neighborhood, it might be on the other side of a river and it might take them 15, 20 minutes to come to your house, right? So it doesn't really give you a good impression of what the reach of these things are. So I use a proportional impact model. Essentially what this does is if this is our so-called police station, we can say that, this police station within 15 minutes can get, this far. And it's just outside of this tract of people with 1,000 people in it, right? So if we look at it, so, roughly 15% of the area of that tract is being covered by this police station. Simple math, 150 people, and that gives us a more accurate view of how many people this facility serves. Now, obviously, police can't travel like that in a perfect circle. So we have to kind of adjust our delivery method to be more in line with the real world, where we go into street networking. Basically, what this does is it allows us to create a range of a service area by adjusting the travel time from a certain point or to a certain point. So if we look at, this is kind of hard to see on this, but if we look at these are police stations, yeah. So within 15 minutes of police stations, these are the areas that these police stations can cover. And you'll see that there's, odd gaps that are cut out because there's no street route to that area within a 15-minute time zone. And so after we have these buffers, we do the exact same calculation as I showed on the previous screen, figure out how many people, figure out how much area these buffers cover within a tract, how many people live in that tract, divide, there you go. And then when you reclassify the numbers, you can get an index that shows pretty much how frequently or how likely it is or the ability of facility of this infrastructure to reach you. Now, environmental impacts aren't as straightforward. They don't follow street networks, right? They can, go through waterways, the air, et cetera. So we can't use the same method to determine the impact. So what I did for this section was I used something called a IDW, an inverse distance weighted formula. Essentially what this does is we take the centroid of the tract. So that's the center point of the tract, which I'm not going to get into the details of that, but it's not always in the center, long and short. But then we take that, we measure, we find out where all the polluting facilities are, which are all publicly available information, usually through the DNR or EPA. And we measure the distance from the centroid to each one of those facilities within a certain radius. Why do we do this? Well, because if we look over here, we have facility number 3 in tract B, but obviously the toxic spread of that facility extends into tract A. So if you were just to do a simple count of how many toxic facilities are in your tract, tract A would only have 2, even though there are 3 different facilities that are impacting the quality, the environmental quality in that tract. So we use this method in order to account for facilities that may not be within the geographic limits of a tract, but still have a demonstrable impact on the environmental quality in that area. So we take these distances, we invert them under the logic that the farther away you are from one of these facilities, the less likely it is that you're going to be impacted by the output of that facility. And then we weigh that by the number of people in the tract. That gives us our final impact number. What's important to note about this, wish I could, can I zoom in? Yes, I can, awesome. So what's important to note about this is that it doesn't inherently mean that if you have a facility in your neighborhood, you will have a high impact. Why? Well, so we can see here, I'm trying to walk in front of it. So we can see here that there's 2 wastewater facilities in this tract right here, in the Chesapeake Bay. The thing is, nobody actually lives here. There's no residents that are officially counted on the census in this tract. Now, that doesn't mean people don't live there. That, there could be people without homes or, people who are, in a precarious living situation who might take up residence in that area, and they'll definitely be affected by this. But officially speaking, nobody lives there. So it has a very low impact. But the tract right next to it and right across the river from it, obviously, because of their proximity to these and the fact that people actually do live here, they have proportionally a much higher impact from these facilities than a area with no population.
That's really helpful to explain.
All right, and last big section is heat and air quality. So heat is the deadliest environmental pathogen that we see in the modern age. And what's really funny about this is that we've been tracking temperature for as long as we as a species have had the ability to track temperature, right? And yet, despite having so much and such accurate heat information, it's really hard to determine the impact of heat because it's so diffuse, right? That can be, you can track it by, heat strokes and, how many people are going into the hospital for heat-related ailments. But that's a really small compared to the enormity of the effects that heat can have on the human body. There was an article, I think, in Washington Post a couple days ago about how people who are afflicted with schizophrenia are uniquely susceptible to heat more than any other population, right? Which isn't really something that's really easy to be captured in data. Now, on the flip side of that is AQI, or your air quality index. Air quality has a really noticeable impact. if you have a large population of children who are developing asthma, you can pretty confidently say that the reason this large group of children in this area are developing asthma is because of the poor air quality. But what you can't say is precisely what that air quality is without taking on the ground measurements. There are some tools that are able to be used to kind of better track these things. But on a large scale, it's incredibly difficult. Now, on that note, a big development that's happened recently is the launch of the TEMPO satellite. This launched in 2023, and it is run by the EPA. The data is all publicly available. If it's not super easy to access yet, but I think they're working on it. And what this does is it gives you hourly updates of the composite of the atmosphere, the troposphere, which is the air that we breathe. Now, the one thing that I should note about this is that this is a satellite. The resolution it gets is 11.2 square kilometers, which is a large area. I think it comes out to like 6 square miles, right? Now, this is from my perspective, from a technological perspective, this is incredible. We're talking about a thing that's circling the Earth from a couple thousand feet up in the air, taking pictures at this amount of scale. But for an individual level, it's not as helpful, which is where the RESIG and Purple comes into play. RESIG is a tool that the EPA is developing, and I think it's in their 5th or 6th iteration now. They keep doing updates to it. But what it does is allows users to pretty quickly and efficiently measure the air quality and other environmental pathogens using a large variety of open and closed data sources. Importantly, the Purple air data, which is publicly accessible, but is very hard to actually access. And what this tool allows you to do is it pulls in all the information from all of the Purple air monitors in 2019 and gives you a much clearer example of what the AQI would be, provided there are sensors in your neighborhood, right? And I know at least in Maryland, we have a pretty large network, at least in the Southeast, but it gets more diffuse as you go up. It really depends on your neighborhood when you're using this tool, but it is a really, really big game changer. So just real quick, the next steps for development, we're going to be looking at more options for resolution. So we're going to be looking at things, how to change the data so it looks at your legislative boundaries, congressional, state, and Senate. And also, we're going to be looking at doing an on-the-ground assessment, like I mentioned earlier, trying to determine how accurate these numbers are to the real world conditions, essentially. And then something else I would like to point out to all of you guys, and I really implore you guys to come and join this conversation. At 3 o'clock, we're going to be doing a focus group discussion about this tool that we're developing called My Block Counts, which is a neighborhood level community data collection effort. Sir, and this I think was going to addresses kind of your concerns. This tool is going to integrate with our EJ screen in order to give regular citizens the ability to contribute data and create a more accurate representation of their EJ quotient in their neighborhood. We're hoping to get that out in the next year. We are working with other outside developers who are actually professionals at this. It's not me. And so it's going to probably look good. I would really love to get you guys' suggestions and input on how we should be developing that app in terms of user accessibility and also in terms of what data should we be collecting with this application. So I was zoomed through that, but that is the MDEJ screen. Thank you. So if you guys have any questions, feel free.
My only question was thinking, I haven't seen the 3 version. I was working with the 2 before, and then the 4 is coming out. Are there data changes with methodologies the same across, or what's the?
Yeah, so four is going to be another pretty complete overhaul of the tool. Each time we redo the tool, we tweak the model to make it more accurate, essentially. MD EJ3 is done. So the next version, I think we're working on the grant for that now. So we usually do like a year or two between versions. So that you should be looking forward to that in like 2024, 25. But yeah, the difference in 3 and 4 is going to be, data quality, data integrity, and the kind of the general functions of the tool, but the bulk of this won't change much in terms of like how you can use it, the general accessibility of it, and the generalized output that you get from using it.
Are your slides available online?
I can make them available, sure.
So is this tool a product of just the GIS team at Sage?
Actually, just me.
Just you?
Just me. Obviously, like this, I took some guidance from the second version, but a lot of the, not a lot, all of the modeling was redone by me. I'm kind of a nerd though, so I kind of enjoyed it.
And then, so all census tracts in Maryland are included in this, nothing's like excluded, like from Octa.
No.
Everything has a score.
Yeah, every place has a score. There are some areas that have gaps in data, and that's just kind of inevitable. But none of them, I think at most, there's a couple of tracks missing like 2 or 3 data points out of dozens, so it's not, I did go through and try to find the most comprehensive data sets I could. The biggest issue was AQI. Trying to determine AQI over such a large area is so hard. It's just, it requires a really specific endeavor to get a high resolution and a high rate of accuracy that we just don't have. We just don't have that kind of capacity right now. So I had to rely on interpolating through the purple air monitors that we got, and then using the tempo data to kind of supplement that for areas where there just were no sensors,
I'm curious, maybe you have a sense, even though it's probably not your specific area of expertise, but Vivek's probably be the one to ask. But so the recent Canadian wildfires, blew a lot of smoke down here. Was that level, say, of particulates, was that significantly above what any neighborhood in this area would ever experience?
Oh yeah, by a factor of like 2. I think we were registering average AQIs during that time in the 400s, which is, just to give you some perspective, they had to use a new color to show the difference in AQI between what we were getting here and what, places farther east or south of us were getting. It was bad.
What about a new color?
Yeah, and I think we went to code maroon.
Yeah.
Has there been discussion, or have any of the states being served by the Region 3 TIC-TAC reached out for assistance making?
I did get one person yesterday emailing me after I gave this presentation, and I just haven't had a chance to respond to them yet. But it is something yes. Short, long and short, yeah.
Okay, so if I write to you, you can provide some slides or?
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah. And if you have any questions for me, going forward.
And then who is creating the MyBlock count?
So we're working with a company called Blue Meta, based out of Baltimore, and so they're taking charge of that development, and we're providing them with guidance in terms of community input and just kind of general data science integrity, that kind of stuff. But they're taking charge of most of that. So that's why this focus group is really important. I really implore you guys to come, is because they need to know what to do, essentially. And the only way you can do that is if you guys tell us, right? We can kind of have our best guess, but we're not on the ground all the time, right? We're stuck in our offices.
What time is it? Are we late for the next?
I think it's lunchtime. Yeah. I believe so here.